The floorboards creaked beneath my bare feet as Grandma Josephine's calloused hand gripped my wrist, pulling me toward the door of that brick house. I was 7 years old, wearing my only white dress, with the lace trim, my hair braided so tight it made my scalp ache. The man waiting on the porch looked at me the way a hungry wolf looks at a lamb. "Is this her?" His voice was rough, like sandpaper against wood.
"Yes, Mr. Anderson. Clean healthy, just like we agreed."
My grandmother's voice was cold as winter stone.
7 years old. Had her birthday last month.
I watched money change hands, crumpled bills disappearing into my grandmother's worn apron. Even then, some primitive instinct screamed danger, but children trust the adults who should protect them. Children don't understand when those same adults count coins earned from their pain. That was the beginning, the moment when innocence died and nightmare began. Good morning, my dear friends. This is Grandma Zelda here with my 72 years of life experience, speaking directly from my modest home in rural Kentucky, where the mountain breeze brings some relief from the heat and from heavy memories that still visit me in dreams. Anyone who sees me today with my white hair, my garden plants in the backyard, and my prayer book always at hand would never imagine the hell I crawled through to reach this peaceful life. Before I begin this difficult story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of America you're listening from. That gives me strength to continue sharing these stories that need to be told. Because somewhere at this very moment, there is a child going through something similar, thinking they are alone, that nobody will believe them.
I was born in 1953 in a small town in Kentucky, so tiny it barely showed up on maps. Just a few dirt roads, a small church, a school that only went up to 4th grade, and lots of poverty. My mother, Sarah, worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset, her hands raw and bleeding from picking cotton and tobacco. My father, he disappeared before I was even born, like so many other men of that era, who couldn't handle the weight of responsibility. We lived in a simple shack on the outskirts of town, me, my mother, and my grandmother, Josephine. Everyone called her Grandma Jo, though there was nothing grandmotherly about her. She was a woman carved from Kentucky mountain stone, with dark skin, wrinkled by the sun, calloused hands that knew violence as well as work, and eyes that never showed mercy. I never saw her smile, not once, in all the years we lived together. Our house was made of wooden planks with gaps that let in wind and rain. The dirt floor was swept clean daily, but dust settled again within hours, a roof that leaked when storms came hard. The 3 of us slept in a single room separated from the kitchen only by an old curtain that had once been blue, but had faded to gray. There was no bathroom inside, just an outhouse in the backyard, one of those with a hole in the ground that we called a pit. At night, we used a chamber pot under the bed so we wouldn't have to venture outside in the dark. Hunger was our constant companion. Some days, our only meal was a thin porridge made with cornmeal and water with a pinch of salt. When my mother managed to bring home vegetables from the farm where she worked, it felt like Christmas morning. Meat was a luxury we saw maybe once a month, and even then it was more bone than flesh. Despite the poverty, I had moments of childhood joy. I played with dolls, made from corn husks, ran barefoot through the yard, climbed trees to pick wild apples. At school, teacher Miss Lorna always said I was smart, that I could be somebody if I studied hard. Zelda's got a gift with words she would tell my mother during the rare parent conferences. She sees things differently than other children. With proper education, she could go far. My mother would nod and smile weakly, but I could see the resignation in her eyes. Education was a luxury we couldn't afford, and everyone knew it. It was shortly after I turned 7 that everything changed. The memory is burned into my mind like a brand on cattle hide. It was a Sunday morning in March, cold and gray. My mother had gone to work at the Richardsons' house in town even on Sunday, because rich folks needed their floors scrubbed and their silver polished, and we needed every penny. I was in the yard playing with smooth pebbles I'd collected from the creek
when my grandmother's voice cut through the morning air like a blade.
Zelda, come here. There's work today.
Work on Sunday. That seemed strange, but I obeyed. In our house, disobedience meant feeling the sting of Grandma Jo's leather belt. She took me inside and gave me a bath in the wooden tub, scrubbing my skin until it was red and raw. Water was precious in our house, rationed carefully, so this thorough washing felt unusual. She combed my hair with rough strokes, making 2 neat braids that pulled tight against my scalp. Then she brought out that white dress, the one I only wore to church on Christmas, with its lace details that my mother had bought at a country fair.
Grandma, why am I getting dressed up like this? Is it a special day?
I asked, confusion mixing with growing unease.
Her hand stopped mid-braid, and she turned me around to face her. Her eyes were harder than I'd ever seen them. Don't ask questions, girl. Just get yourself ready. Today we're going to the house of an important man who's going to help our family. He has work for you.
Something cold settled in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't name, then but now recognize as pure instinct, warning me of danger. Children don't understand these warnings. They trust the adults who should protect them. We walked for almost an hour, leaving our little town and heading toward Anderson's farm. It was a big house, made of red brick, with a wraparound porch and a black Ford parked outside, symbols of wealth that seemed impossible in our world of poverty. The man waiting on the porch looked old to my child's eyes, probably around 50, with a pot belly straining against his suspenders, sweaty, despite the cool morning and thick mustache that didn't hide his wet lips. His hands were hairy with dirty fingernails, and when he looked at me, I wanted to disappear.
Is this her? He asked, examining me like I was livestock at market. Yes, Mr. Anderson. Clean, healthy, just like we agreed. 7 years old. Had her birthday last month.
They spoke in low voices, but I caught fragments. First time. Careful with her. Same price we discussed. I watched my grandmother's face as she tucked folded bills into her apron pocket, her expression never changing.
I'll bring her back before nightfall, Anderson said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand.
That's when panic hit me like a lightning strike. She was leaving me here, with this strange man whose eyes made my skin crawl. I grabbed her skirt, my voice breaking. "Grandma, don't go. I want to come with you. Please." She bent down her fingers, digging into my shoulders like talons. When she spoke, her voice was different, colder than I'd ever heard it.
Listen here, Zelda. You're going to stay and help Mr. Anderson with whatever work he needs. It's woman's work, understand? Every girl has to learn it sooner or later. If you're not good, we don't eat this week. Do you understand me?
I nodded, swallowing tears that burned my throat. And don't tell your mother anything when you get back. This is our secret. If you tell, I'll know, and you'll get beaten until you can't sit down for a week. Are you listening to me? Again, I nodded, paralyzed by fear and confusion. She turned and walked away without looking back even once. She left me there alone with that man who smiled in a way that made my entire body shiver.
Come on, girl. Let's go inside. I've got a job for you.
What happened in that house during the following hours is something I spent decades trying to forget. Even now at 72, the memories come back with such clarity that I sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night. He led me to a back room with heavy curtains blocking out the sunlight. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cigarettes, and something else, something sour and wrong. There was a bed with rumpled sheets and a chair in the corner where his clothes were thrown carelessly.
Now, little girl,
he said, his voice taking on a different tone. I'm going to teach you a woman's job, a special job that'll help your family. You want to help your family, don't you? I nodded, still not understanding, but desperately wanting to please to do whatever would get me home safely. Good. Now you're going to be a good girl and do everything I say. No crying, no fussing. Just be still and let me show you what grown-ups do. The details of what followed are burned into my memory with a clarity that time has never dimmed. The confusion, the pain, the terror of not understanding why this was happening to me. The way he held me down, when I tried to pull away. The words he whispered that made no sense to my 7-year-old mind, but filled me with shame I couldn't name. I remember crying, begging him to stop calling for my mother, for my grandmother, for anyone who might save me. But no one came, no one heard. And when it was over, I was bleeding, shaking something fundamental inside me, forever broken. He took me to the bathroom afterward, cleaned me with a rough towel that scraped my already raw skin, and helped me back into the white dress that was now stained with blood and shame. "You did good, little girl," he said, his voice gentle now in a way that made my stomach turn. "But remember, if you tell anyone about our special work, I'll have to come to your house and hurt your mother and grandmother. You don't want that, do you?" I shook my head, unable to speak, my voice lost somewhere in the darkness of that room. When my grandmother came back to collect me, the sun was setting behind the mountains. I was sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing, my body there but my mind somewhere far away. A dissociation that would become my primary survival mechanism. She looked at me, at the stains on my dress, at the way I couldn't meet her eyes, and showed no emotion whatsoever. "Mr. Anderson says you behaved well," she said matter-of-factly. "That's how it needs to be." On the walk home, she explained the new reality of my life with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "This is normal, Zelda. All girls go through it. It's work that only women can do, and the money helps buy food for the whole family. Don't make that face, it wasn't so bad. Next time will be easier. Next time." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I stopped walking and vomited right there on the side of the road, my body rejecting not just food, but the entire horrific reality I was being forced to accept. My grandmother gave me a few impatient pats on the back. "Stop with this fussiness. Do you want to starve? Do you want to see your mother kill herself working in those fields? This is all you need to do to help the family. Other girls your age do much worse things." When we got home, my mother was already there, sitting at our small table, her face etched with worry. "Where have you been?" "I've been worried sick." My grandmother smoothly wove her lie. "We went to help Mrs. Henderson with her sick husband. Zelda played with the other children in the yard and got her dress dirty. You know how children are." I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to throw myself into my mother's arms and tell her everything. But the words wouldn't come. The fear, the shame, the confusion, it all tangled together in my throat like barbed wire. That night, lying on the thin mattress I shared with my mother, I cried silently until exhaustion claimed me. She must have sensed something was wrong, because she held me tighter than usual, her arm protectively around my small body. But she didn't ask questions. Maybe from exhaustion, maybe from fear of the answers. What I didn't know that night, what would take me years to fully understand, was that this first visit was just the beginning. My grandmother had discovered a source of income, and I was the product she was selling. The pattern established itself with horrifying regularity. Every few days, my grandmother would call me with that special tone in her voice, and I would know what was coming. Sometimes it was Anderson's farm. Sometimes it was other places' houses I'd never seen, with men whose faces blur together in my memory like a nightmarish parade. Each time, she would get me ready with the same ritualistic care. The bath, the clean dress, the tightly braided hair. She would walk me to these places, negotiate her price, and leave me in the hands of men who saw me not as a child, but as a commodity they had purchased. The excuses for my mother varied. We were helping at someone's house. We were visiting a sick neighbor. We were picking up donated clothes. Always on days when my mother worked away from home so she wouldn't witness the preparation or see the state I was in when we returned. As weeks turned to months, the business became more organized. My grandmother developed a network of regular clients and even established a price structure. She would negotiate at front doors like she was selling vegetables at market, discussing duration and special services, while I stood beside her, head down, knowing I was the merchandise being bartered. "She's clean, healthy, well-behaved," she would say to prospective clients. "This is the price for 2 hours.
If you want more time, it's extra. If you want to do special things, we can discuss it. Sometimes she would leave me and return hours later. Other times, especially when there were multiple men, she would stay in the living room or kitchen drinking coffee or whiskey chatting about crops and weather, as if nothing horrific was happening in the next room. I tried to resist once. I must have been 8 years old, maybe 9. When she called me for work, I hid under the bed, pressing myself against the wall, hoping she wouldn't find me. But she dragged me out by my hair, her fingers tangled in my braids, and beat me with her leather belt until my back was covered in welts. Then she locked me in the woodshed behind the house where we kept firewood and tools. I stayed there for 2 days without food, just a tin cup of water she would push through the door crack once a day. When she finally let me out, I was so weak and terrified that I never resisted again. "This is how life is," she would always say after punishing me. "Women were born to suffer. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be." The money she received never seemed to improve our living conditions. Our house remained a shack. Food remained scarce, and my mother continued working herself to exhaustion. I later discovered that much of what my grandmother earned went to the whiskey she drank in secret and to the card games she played with other women in the neighborhood. I tried to tell my mother once when I was almost 8. I waited for a moment when we were alone. My grandmother had gone to the general store in town, and my mother was mending clothes by the light of our single kerosene lamp. Mama," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma Joe takes me to men's houses. They hurt me. They do things." The slap came so fast and hard that I saw stars. The sound echoed in our small room like a gunshot. "What lies are you making up about your grandmother?" Her voice was shaking with rage. "She takes care of you while I kill myself working. How dare you be so ungrateful? Such a shameful child." I never tried to tell her again. I understood then that I was completely alone in this nightmare, that even my own mother would choose to believe lies rather than face the truth. Years passed in this hellish routine. From 7 to 9, from 9 to 10, from 10 to 11. Each year brought new faces, new houses, new variations of the same horror. I learned to disconnect my mind from my body during the worst moments, to float somewhere above the pain and watch it happen to someone else. At school, when I was still allowed to attend, my teachers noticed the change. I had been a bright student, eager to learn, but now I could barely concentrate. I would fall asleep at my desk, wake up screaming from nightmares, or start crying for no apparent reason. Miss Lorna, my teacher, tried to reach out to me several times. "Zelda, is everything all right at home? You seem troubled, child." I would look at her kind face, at the genuine concern in her eyes, and the truth would rise in my throat like vomit. But then I would remember my grandmother's threats, the beating I'd received from my mother, and the words would die before they could be spoken. "I'm just tired, Miss Lorna, helping a lot at home." She would nod, but I could see she wasn't convinced. Several times she kept me after class trying to get me to open up. Once she even came to our house to speak with my mother about my declining performance. Zelda was such a promising student. She told my mother while I stood in the corner, my heart hammering. Now she can barely write her own name. She falls asleep in class, has nightmares. I'm worried about her. My mother glanced at my grandmother, who was sitting in her chair, face stone still. "The girl helps a lot around the house," my grandmother said firmly. "Perhaps school is too much for her. Some children aren't meant for books." Miss Lorna looked at me, and I saw her taking in my appearance, the way I flinched when adults moved too quickly, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I seemed to shrink into myself. "I think education is important for every child," she said carefully. "Zelda has a gift. With proper support, we appreciate your concern," my grandmother interrupted. "But we know what's best for our family." Miss Lorna left, but not before giving me a long, searching look that said she suspected something was deeply wrong. That night, my grandmother made it clear what would happen if I said anything to my teacher. If you tell that woman anything about our business, I'll make sure you never see the inside of a schoolhouse again, and your mother will lose her job. I'll make sure of that too. Is that what you want? I was removed from school shortly after at age 10. My grandmother decided I had learned enough and that my time would be better spent working. In reality, she was afraid I might eventually tell someone the truth. My mother protested weakly. Education was important to her. She had never learned to read well and wanted better for me. But my grandmother's word was law in our house. A 10-year-old girl needs to learn to keep house, not waste time with books, she declared. I never learned to read, and I'm alive and strong. Book learning is for rich people. With school gone, my world became even smaller. No friends, no teachers, no contact with the outside world beyond the terrible visits my grandmother arranged. I lived in a universe composed only of our shack and the houses where men purchased my body. By the time I turned 11, my grandmother's business had expanded. She had developed a reputation in the region for providing young, clean girls to men with particular tastes. The frequency of visits increased to 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more than once in a single day. One particularly terrible night stands out in my memory. I was taken to a remote farm for what my grandmother called a special party. The client was a man they called Colonel Zachary, though I doubt he'd ever seen military service. He was celebrating his 50th birthday and had paid extra for what he called exclusive entertainment. When we arrived, there was music and laughter coming from the farmhouse. Men were drinking heavily, their voices loud and slurred. My grandmother had dressed me in a pink dress she'd sewn herself with ribbons in my hair that made me look even younger than my 11 years. Today is Special Zelda, she said as we walked toward the house. Colonel Zachary paid very well for you. You're going to be nice to him and his friends understand. Do everything they ask. The plural friends sent ice through my veins. Usually, it was one man at a time. But that night, there were 4 of them waiting in the back room, all middle-aged, all drunk, all looking at me with the same hungry expression. The birthday present has arrived, one of them shouted when we entered. Colonel Zachary smiled and patted my head like I was a pet. He handed my grandmother a thick roll of bills, more money than I'd ever seen her receive. Make yourselves comfortable, she said, pocketing the money. Just don't hurt the girl too much. I have another appointment tomorrow. She left, closing the door behind her, abandoning me to 4 adult men who had paid for the right to destroy what was left of my childhood. What happened in that room is burned into my memory with a clarity that 60 years haven't dimmed. They took turns, one after another, while the others watched and drank. When one finished, he would go drink more and return for another round. I lost count of how many times each one violated my small body. At some point, I fainted from pain and exhaustion. When I woke up, I was thrown on a dirty mattress in a corner, bleeding heavily, my body covered in bruises. I couldn't stand up properly, couldn't even cry anymore. All tears had been wrung out of me. My grandmother appeared in the doorway as dawn was breaking, irritated by the delay. Get up, girl. Your mother will be coming home from her night shift soon. She can't find you missing. She didn't help me stand. She just stood there tapping her foot impatiently while I struggled to gather the strength to move. When she saw I could barely walk, she let out an exasperated sigh. Always this fussiness. Stop making such a production. I've told you before this is normal. Every woman goes through it. On the walk home, stumbling along the dirt road, I asked her something that had been tormenting me for years. Grandma, why do you do this to me? Don't you love me even a little bit? She stopped walking and looked at me with those cold, empty eyes. Love doesn't fill empty bellies, girl. When I was your age, my mother did the same thing to me. That's how it is in this world. Poor women only have their bodies to sell. The sooner you learn that, the less you'll suffer. It was the only time she ever mentioned her own past. She never spoke of it again. But those words haunted me for years. An endless cycle of grandmothers selling granddaughters who grew up to sell their own granddaughters. Was there no escape from this curse? When we reached home, my mother was waiting, her face etched with worry. Where have you been all night? I've been sick with worry. My grandmother delivered her practiced lie. We went to help the Hendersons with their sick father. The work took longer than expected, and it was too dark to walk home safely. Why is she limping, and what's this bruise on her neck? My mother's questions came sharp and fast, her maternal instincts finally awakening. She fell down the stairs while cleaning the upper floors. "Clumsy child, you know how she is?" I stood there swaying on my feet, praying my mother would see through the lie, would demand the truth, would finally protect me. But she just sighed and helped me to bed. "You need to be more careful, Zelda. I worry about you." After that night, I was sick for almost 2 weeks. High fever, intense pain, a foul-smelling discharge that caused burning agony. My mother wanted to take me to the doctor in the next town, but my grandmother refused. "It's just a bad cold. Give her garlic tea and lemon, it'll pass." She knew a doctor would recognize the signs of severe sexual abuse, would ask questions she couldn't answer. So I suffered at home, receiving only the limited care my exhausted mother could provide between her work shifts. As soon as the fever broke, even though I was still in pain, my grandmother was already planning my next visit. "Get ready. Mr. Patterson is expecting you this afternoon." For the first time in my life, I openly rebelled. I threw the dress she handed me onto the floor and screamed. "I won't go. I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of being hurt." The slap knocked me backwards onto the bed. She had never hit me in front of my mother, but that day we were alone. "Listen here, you ungrateful little brat. Do you think food appears on our table by magic? Do you think this roof over your head is free? Without the money from your work, we would have starved long ago." I cowered on the bed, expecting more blows, but she changed tactics. Her voice became quieter, more menacing. "If you don't go today, you don't eat another bite in this house. I'll lock up all the food and keep the key. Let's see how long you last on just water." It wasn't an empty threat. She had done this before when I showed any sign of resistance a day without food, sometimes too, but from her tone, I knew this time would be different. "And if you keep disobeying me, I'll send you away to work in the city. I know people who take girls to Louisville to Cincinnati. There you'll really learn what suffering is." The threat of being sent away from everything I knew to strangers, who might be even worse than the men here, terrified me more than anything. So I went to Mr. Patterson's house that afternoon, and I continued going to all the other houses in the weeks that followed. Resistance had too high a price. Around this time when I was 12, and felt like I had aged decades beyond my years, a neighbor woman named Miss Nancy began to take notice of me. She was a healer, what people called a root woman, who made herbal remedies and delivered babies. She was older than my grandmother, with silver hair and hands that always smelled of medicinal herbs. Miss Nancy had a way of looking at people that seemed to see right through to their souls. She would watch me when I was in the yard hanging clothes or feeding our scraggly chickens, and I could feel her studying me with those sharp, knowing eyes. One day, when I was coughing up blood, I had developed tuberculosis, probably from one of the diseased men my grandmother sold me to. Miss Nancy came to our house. "That child needs doctoring," she told my grandmother firmly. "TB is nothing to play with. I've seen it kill whole families." My grandmother was reluctant to let anyone get too close to me, but Miss Nancy's reputation as a healer was too strong to ignore. She had saved lives in our community, and refusing her help would have raised suspicions. "I suppose you can try your herbs," my grandmother said grudgingly. "But nothing fancy. We can't afford Dr. Bills." Miss Nancy came every day for the next month, bringing teas, poultices, and tinctures that slowly helped me recover. But more than that, she brought something I had almost forgotten existed: genuine human kindness. She would sit beside my bed, spooning bitter medicine into my mouth, and talk to me softly about her own childhood, about the plants she gathered, about the healing properties of different herbs. For the first time in years, I felt like a real person, not just a commodity. One afternoon, when we were alone, my grandmother had gone to town, and my mother was at work. Miss Nancy asked me the question that changed everything. Child, what has that woman been doing to you? This body has too many marks to be just from falls and accidents." Her voice was different from any other I had heard. There was no judgment, no suspicion, just deep compassion that broke through all my defenses. For the first time in years,
I told the truth. I told her everything. About the first visit to Anderson's farm when I was 7. About the years of abuse, the different men, the threats, the beatings. About my mother's refusal to believe me. About the loneliness, the fear. The feeling that I was trapped in a nightmare with no escape. I cried so hard I could barely speak. Miss Nancy held my hands and listened in silence, occasionally wiping away her own tears. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not pity, but righteous anger. "Child," she said firmly, "what they've done to you is a crime, a sin against God and nature. Your grandmother has no right to sell your body. No one does." Those words were like water in the desert. Someone finally validated what I had felt all along, that this was wrong, that I didn't deserve it, that it wasn't normal or acceptable. "We need to get you away from here," Miss Nancy continued. "I know people in Cincinnati who help girls like you. There are places where you can be safe, where you can go to school, where no one will hurt you." For the first time in years, I felt something other than fear and resignation. I felt hope. We made plans in whispered conversations. Miss Nancy would contact her friends in the city. We would wait until my grandmother was away. On one of her longer trips, she sometimes went to visit her sister in the next county. When the time was right, I would leave with Miss Nancy. "What about my mother?" I asked. The thought of leaving her filled me with guilt. "Your mother is a grown woman. She can make her own choices, but you're a child, Zelda. You need to be protected." That night, I couldn't sleep. The possibility of escape, of safety, of a life where I didn't have to endure the hands of violent men on my body, it was too powerful, too wonderful to allow sleep. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, Miss Nancy was found collapsed in her garden. A stroke, the neighbors said. She was taken to the hospital in the county seat, but she never regained consciousness. My only ally, my chance at salvation, was gone. The grief nearly broke me. I attended her funeral, standing beside my grandmother and mother screaming inside, while they spoke of God's will and how Miss Nancy was in a better place. I wanted to shout that she was supposed to save me, that without her, I was lost, that God had abandoned me just like everyone else. But I stood silent, tears streaming down my face as they lowered into the ground the only person who had ever believed me. 2 weeks after Miss Nancy's funeral, my grandmother told me we were going to a new client. Someone she had never mentioned before at a farm I had never visited. "This one's different," she said as she prepared me for the visit. "He pays well, but he has particular tastes. You do whatever he says, understand. No crying, no fussing." There was something in her tone that made me more frightened than usual. After 5 years of this nightmare, I had learned to read the signs that indicated when a client might be especially dangerous. We walked for over an hour to reach the farm, which was isolated even by our rural standards. The house was run-down paint, peeling with broken windows, and a yard full of rusted farm equipment. The man waiting for us on the porch looked different from the others, thinner, with wild eyes and a nervous energy that made my skin crawl. "You're late," he said to my grandmother, not taking his eyes off me. "Sorry, Mr. Carlyle. The girl was being difficult." He looked me up and down like I was a piece of meat, then handed my grandmother her money. "She's small for 12, he said. "She's healthy and well-behaved. That's what matters." My grandmother left without even looking back, and I was alone with this man whose very presence made every instinct scream danger. He led me to a back room that smelled of stale beer and something else, something metallic and frightening. The bed was unmade, covered with dirty sheets, and there were strange tools on a table beside it that I didn't recognize. "Now, little girl," he said, his voice taking on a different quality. "I'm going to teach you things the others probably didn't. Special things." What happened next was different from all the other times. This man didn't just want to abuse me, he wanted to hurt me, to humiliate me, to completely destroy what little was left of my spirit. He used the tools from the table.
He made me do things that were so degrading, so painful, that I felt my sanity beginning to slip away. But the worst was yet to come. When he was finished with the sexual abuse, he didn't let me get dressed. Instead, he grabbed me by the throat and began to squeeze. His hands were strong, and I could feel the life being crushed out of me. "Nobody's going to miss you, you little whore," he whispered as he tightened his grip. "Your grandmother already got her money. What happens to you now doesn't matter to anyone." I looked into his eyes and saw something I had never seen before: the genuine desire to kill. This wasn't abuse anymore. This was attempted murder. Black spots began to dance in my vision. My lungs burned for air. This was it. After 5 years of hell, I was going to die in this filthy room at the hands of a man whose name I barely knew. But something inside me, some deep survival instinct that had been dormant for years, suddenly awakened. In that moment between life and death, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. With a sudden, desperate movement, I brought my knee up as hard as I could between his legs. He doubled over in pain, releasing his grip on my throat. In that split second of opportunity, I pushed him backward with all my strength. He stumbled off balance and fell hard, hitting his head on the corner of the wooden bedside table. Blood spurted from a gash on his temple, and he lay still. I didn't stop to see if he was unconscious or dead. I didn't stop to gather my clothes. I ran from that room naked and bleeding, out of that house, away from that farm, away from that life that had never been a life at all. I ran down the dirt road like a wild animal fleeing hunters, my bare feet cutting on stones, my body naked and vulnerable, but driven by a desperation stronger than any physical pain. I didn't look back once. I was certain he would recover, would come after me, would drag me back to finish what he had started. Night was falling fast, but the darkness didn't frighten me. I had been living in darkness for years. What terrified me was the possibility of being found, of being returned to that hell. After running until my lungs felt like they would burst, I spotted a small chapel by the roadside. It was one of those simple country churches, just a single room with a few wooden pews and a plain wooden cross on the wall. I stumbled inside and collapsed in a corner, pulling an old tablecloth from the altar to cover my nakedness. I was shaking uncontrollably from cold, from shock, from the realization that I had finally done what I should have done years ago. I had fought back. That night, curled up in the corner of that chapel, I prayed for the first time in years. Not the rote prayers my mother had taught me, but desperate sobbing pleas for protection, for guidance, for some sign that I might survive this night and find a way to freedom. I woke to the sound of footsteps and the creak of the chapel door opening. Panic flooded through me. Had he found me? Was my grandmother here to drag me back? Good heavens, is someone there? It was a woman's voice, elderly but kind. I peeked out from behind the altar and saw a black woman with silver hair tied in a neat bun, wearing a simple dress and carrying a basket of flowers. "Child, I know you're there. I can see the blood on the floor. I'm not going to hurt you." Something in her voice, a gentleness I had almost forgotten could exist, made me trust her. I stood up slowly, the tablecloth wrapped around me, and she gasped when she saw my condition. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "What has someone done to you, child?" I couldn't speak. I just stood there swaying on my feet, tears streaming down my face. Without hesitation, she took off her shawl and wrapped it around my shoulders. "Come with me," she said gently. "Let's get you cleaned up and safe." This woman, Miss Florence, I would learn, took me to her small farm about 5 miles away. She didn't ask questions about what had happened or how I had come to be naked and bleeding in a chapel. She simply cared for me like I was her own child. She filled a basin with warm water and gently cleaned my wounds.
She gave me a clean nightgown and made me chicken soup, spooning it into my mouth when my hands shook too much to hold the spoon myself. It was only after she had fed me and tucked me into a clean bed that she asked, "Do you want to tell me what happened to you, child?" And for the second time in my life, I told the truth. I told her everything about my grandmother's business, about the years of abuse, about the man who had tried to kill me, about my escape. Miss Florence listened without judgment, holding my hand while I spoke. When I finished, she was crying. "You're safe now," she said simply. "As long as I draw breath, no one will hurt you again." I stayed hidden on Miss Florence's farm for 3 months, slowly healing both physically and emotionally. She was a skilled herbalist, and under her care, the infections and injuries from years of abuse began to heal. More importantly, she helped me remember what it felt like to be treated with kindness and respect. During this time, I learned that my grandmother and mother had reported me missing to the sheriff. They claimed I was a troubled girl who had run away from home, possibly stealing money. The man I had pushed, Mr. Carlyle, had survived with a concussion and some stitches, but he was looking for me too, though, for different reasons. Miss Florence kept me hidden and safe, teaching me about herbs and healing, about the strength that comes from surviving trauma, about the possibility of building a new life from the ashes of the old. But it was during my 3rd month with her that I learned something that changed everything I thought I knew about my story. Miss Florence had gone to town for supplies and returned with news that shook me to my core. "Child," she said, sitting down beside me with a grave expression, "I heard something today that I think you need to know. It's about your mother." My heart began to race. Had something happened to her? Despite everything, I still loved her, still worried about her. "What is it?" I asked. "I was talking to Mrs. Patterson at the general store, you know, the one whose husband, well, you know, she told me something that's been weighing on the town's conscience for years." Miss Florence paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Your mother knew, Zelda. She knew what your grandmother was doing to you." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's not possible." I tried to tell her, and she slapped you because she was afraid of what would happen if she acknowledged the truth. Mrs. Patterson said your mother came to her husband 6 months after you started working. She was crying, begging him to stop, saying she couldn't bear what was happening to her daughter. My world tilted on its axis. My mother had known all this time. She had known and done nothing. But why didn't she stop it? Why didn't she protect me? Miss Florence took my hands in hers. "Because your grandmother threatened to kill her if she interfered. And more than that, she threatened to send you away to work in the city brothels, where you would have suffered even more and probably died young." The revelation was like an earthquake in my mind, reshaping everything I thought I understood about my family, about my mother's betrayal, about my years of isolation. "Mrs. Patterson said your mother tried to save money to run away with you. She was planning to take you to Cincinnati to start over, but your grandmother found out and beat her so badly she couldn't work for weeks. After that, she gave up trying to resist." I sat in stunned silence, processing this information. My mother, the woman I had thought betrayed me, who had slapped me when I tried to tell her the truth, had actually been trying to save me, had been living with the knowledge of what was happening to me, and had felt powerless to stop it. "There is additional information," Miss Florence spoke quietly. "Your grandmother had similar arrangements with your mother during her childhood. This situation has occurred across multiple generations. Your mother was involved in these circumstances from a young age. When she became pregnant with you at 14 as a result of these situations, your grandmother considered it part of the established pattern." The full horror of my family's history crashed over me like a tidal wave. Generation after generation of women and girls sold and abused, trapped in a cycle of violence and poverty. My mother had been a victim too, just like me. "Why didn't anyone stop it?" I whispered. "Because that's how it was in those days, child. People turned a blind eye to what happened in poor families,
and your grandmother was feared in the community. She knew secrets about many of the men who used you. If anyone had tried to stop her, she would have destroyed them. This revelation changed everything. The anger I had carried toward my mother for years began to transform into something else, understanding pity and a deeper grief for what our family had endured. But it also gave me a new determination. The cycle had to be broken. It had to end with me. 3 months after my escape, Miss Florence made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. "You can't stay hidden here forever, child," she said one morning as we worked in her herb garden. "You're 13 now. You need schooling, a chance at a real life." The thought of leaving this safe haven terrified me. What if they find me? What if my grandmother— "Your grandmother is dead, Zelda." The words stopped me cold. I stared at her, not sure I had heard correctly. "She died 2 weeks ago. Cirrhosis of the liver. All that drinking finally caught up with her." I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, grief, anger, and something that might have been freedom. The woman who had orchestrated my years of hell was gone. I would never have to fear her again. "What about my mother?" I asked. "She's still alive, still working for the Richardsons. From what I hear, she's been drinking heavily since your grandmother died. Guilt, probably." Miss Florence sat down beside me, her arthritic hands gentle on my shoulders. "I think it's time you went to see her. Time you both had a chance to speak the truth to each other." The idea terrified me, but I knew she was right. I couldn't move forward with my life until I faced the past and all the people who had shaped it. We made the trip to my childhood home on a gray October morning. The shack looked even smaller and more ramshackle than I remembered. The garden was overgrown, the yard littered with empty whiskey bottles. My mother was sitting on the front steps, looking older than her 31 years. Her hair was streaked with gray, her face lined with worry and grief. When she saw me approaching, she stood up slowly, her eyes wide with shock. "Zelda," she whispered, "is that really you?" I nodded, unable to speak. She looked at me for a long moment, taking in the changes. I was taller now, healthier from Miss Florence's care, but there was something different in my eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I thought you were dead," she said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I've been praying every night that you were safe somewhere, but I thought—" "I know," I said simply. "I know everything. About what Grandma threatened you with. About what happened to you when you were young. About why you couldn't help me." She collapsed, then falling to her knees in the dirt, sobbing with years of suppressed grief and guilt. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I tried, I swear I tried, but she said she'd kill us both if I interfered. She said she'd send you away to places where you'd suffer even more." I knelt beside her and took her in my arms, this broken woman who had been my mother and my fellow victim. We held each other and cried for all the years of pain, for all the words we couldn't say, for all the protection that should have been given but wasn't. "The cycle ends here," I told her firmly. "It ends with us. No more little girls will be sold in this family. No more." She nodded, clinging to me like I was her salvation rather than her child. We talked for hours that day, finally sharing the truth that had been hidden for so long. She told me about her own childhood, about the years of abuse she had endured, about the guilt and shame that had eaten at her soul. I told her about my escape, about Miss Florence, about my determination to build a different kind of life. When it was time to leave, she begged me to take her with me. "I can't live with myself anymore, Zelda. I can't live in this house, in this place where so much evil happened. Please, let me come with you." I looked at her, this woman who had failed to protect me, but who had also been a victim herself, and felt something I hadn't expected: forgiveness. "Come with me," I said. "But understand that we're not just leaving this place. We're leaving the past. We're going to build something new,
Something clean, something that honors all the little girls who came before us. She nodded eagerly, gathering her few belongings. We walked away from that shack together, leaving behind the scene of so much trauma ready to begin the long journey toward healing. Miss Florence had connections in Cincinnati, a network of women who helped girls and women escaping from abusive situations. She arranged for my mother and me to travel there together, to start over in a place where our past wouldn't follow us. The bus ride to Cincinnati was the longest journey of my life, not just in miles, but in the emotional distance I was traveling from my childhood. I was 13 years old, but I felt ancient carrying the weight of experiences that would have broken many adults. My mother sat beside me holding my hand, both of us silent for most of the journey. What do you say to your child when you failed to protect them in the most fundamental way? What do you say to your mother when you understand that she was as much a victim as you were? Cincinnati was overwhelming, huge buildings, crowds of people, noise and smells I had never experienced. Coming from rural Kentucky, it might as well have been another planet. But with Miss Florence's help, we found our way to St. Mary's Home for Girls, a shelter run by Catholic nuns. Sister Catherine, the head of the home, was a stern but kind woman who had seen many girls like me. She didn't ask for details about our past, just nodded when Miss Florence explained that I needed safety in schooling. "She can stay here," Sister Catherine said, looking at me with compassionate eyes. "We'll see that she gets an education and learns skills that will help her build a good life." My mother found work as a seamstress in a factory downtown and rented a small room nearby. For the first time in our lives, we were both free from my grandmother's tyranny, free from the cycle of abuse, free to imagine a different future. The adjustment to city life was difficult. I had never lived among so many people, never been part of an institution, never had to follow so many rules. The other girls at the home came from various backgrounds. Some were orphans, others were runaways, still others had been removed from abusive homes by the authorities. But slowly, I began to adapt. I went back to school for the first time in years, struggling at first to keep up with children who had never had their education interrupted. But I had always been bright, and with the help of patient teachers, I began to catch up. Sister Margaret, the English teacher, took a special interest in me. She saw something in my writing, a depth of experience and emotional understanding that was unusual for someone my age. You have a gift, Zelda," she told me one afternoon as she reviewed an essay I had written about rural life. "You can take your experiences, even the difficult ones, and transform them into something that helps others understand the world better." She encouraged me to keep a journal to write about my feelings and experiences. At first, it was too painful. The memories would come flooding back, and I would have to stop writing and cry. But gradually, I discovered that putting my story on paper helped me process it, helped me gain some control over memories that had been controlling me. I spent 4 years at St. Mary's from age 13 to 17. They were years of slow healing, of gradual learning to trust again, of discovering that not all adults were predators, that there were good people in the world who wanted to help rather than hurt. During this time, I saw my mother regularly. She was healing too in her own way. The work at the factory was hard but honest. She was earning her own money, making her own decisions, living without fear for the first time in her adult life. We would meet for Sunday dinners at a small restaurant near the home, talking about our weeks, our hopes, our plans for the future. Slowly, we were rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual understanding and shared determination to break the cycle that had trapped our family for generations. When I turned 17, I was faced with a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I could stay in Cincinnati, find work in the city, and build a conventional urban life. Or I could return to Kentucky, to the rural life I had always known, but on my own terms. The decision was made for me when I received word that Miss Florence was dying. The woman who had saved my life, who had shown me what kindness looked like, was in her final days and wanted to see me. I made the journey back to Kentucky with my mother, both of us nervous about returning to a place that held so many terrible memories. But Miss Florence's farm was a sanctuary, a place where healing had begun, and I knew I needed to be there. Miss Florence was bedridden, her body frail, but her mind still sharp. She smiled when she saw me reaching out her thin hand to touch my face. "Look at you," she whispered. "Strong, healthy, educated. You've become everything I hoped you could be." We spent her final days together, talking about life, about healing, about the future. She had no family of her own, and in her will, she left me her farm, 20 acres of good land, a small house, and extensive herb gardens. "This land has been a place of healing," she told me in one of our last conversations. "I want you to continue that work. Help other women who have been hurt the way you were hurt. Break the cycle not just for your own family, but for others." She died peacefully in her sleep, and I held her hand as she passed. At her funeral, I met many of the women she had helped over the years, women who had been abused, abandoned, or forgotten by society. They all had stories of how Miss Florence had saved them, healed them, given them hope. Standing beside her grave, I made a promise that would guide the rest of my life. I would continue her work. I would use her farm, her knowledge, and my own experiences to help other women and girls who had suffered as I had suffered. My mother decided to stay in Cincinnati, where she had built a new life for herself. But she supported my decision to return to Kentucky, understanding that I needed to face the place where my trauma had occurred and transform it into something positive. At 18, I returned to rural Kentucky as the owner of Miss Florence's farm. I was no longer the frightened, abused child who had fled naked down a dark road. I was a young woman with education, with purpose, with a mission to heal myself and others. The first months back on the farm were challenging. I was alone for the first time in my life, responsible for maintaining the property, the gardens, and the livestock. But Miss Florence had taught me well, and I had learned practical skills at the home in Cincinnati. I threw myself into the work of restoration. I repaired the house, expanded the herb gardens, and studied Miss Florence's extensive notes on medicinal plants and healing techniques. I also continued my own education, reading voraciously and corresponding with teachers from St. Mary's who helped me continue learning. Word spread slowly through the community that the Root Woman's Farm was active again. Women began to come seeking help, some for physical ailments, others for emotional healing, still others seeking refuge from abusive situations. I helped them all using the knowledge Miss Florence had given me, combined with my own hard-won understanding of trauma and survival. I provided herbal remedies for physical problems, but more importantly, I offered a listening ear, a safe place to stay, and living proof that it was possible to survive the worst kinds of abuse and build a meaningful life. It was during this time that I met Joseph, the man who would become my husband. He was an agricultural extension agent who came to the farm to discuss soil conservation techniques. He was 5 years older than me, with gentle eyes and hands that had never been raised in violence. At first, I was terrified of him. Despite all my healing, I still struggled with trusting men, still flinched when they came too close. But Joseph was patient, kind, and respectful of my boundaries. He courted me slowly with small gestures and genuine conversation, never pushing for more than I was comfortable giving. When I finally told him about my past, about the abuse, about my grandmother's business, about the years of trauma, he didn't recoil in horror or judgment. Instead, he held me while I cried and told me that my past made me stronger, not damaged. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he said. "You survived things that would have broken most people, and you're using that survival to help others. That's not damage, that's heroism." We married in 1973 when I was 20. It was a small ceremony at the country chapel where Miss Florence had once prayed, the same chapel where I had hidden as a frightened child. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was reclaiming that space, transforming it from a place of fear into a place of celebration. Joseph understood that our marriage would be different from others. He was patient with my struggles with physical intimacy, never pressuring me, always letting me set the pace. He supported my work helping other women, even when it meant our home was often full of strangers seeking refuge. Our children came slowly, 3 of them over the course of 8 years. Nina, born in 1975, was followed by Matthew in 1978,
and Claire in 1981. Each birth was a miracle to me, a sign that life and love could triumph over the darkness of the past.
I was determined to break the cycle of abuse that had plagued my family for generations. My children grew up in a home where their bodies were respected, where they were taught about consent and personal boundaries, where they learned that violence was never acceptable. I talked to them honestly about my past in age-appropriate ways, making sure they understood that some adults hurt children, but that they should never be afraid to tell me if anyone ever made them uncomfortable. I wanted them to have the protection I had never had. Joseph was a wonderful father involved and nurturing, showing our children what healthy masculinity looked like. He taught them that strength came from protecting others, not from dominating them. As my children grew, so did my work helping other women. Word spread throughout Kentucky and beyond about the farm where women could find refuge and healing. I began to formalize my efforts working with social workers and women's organizations to create a network of support. In 1985, I founded the Wildflowers Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women and girls escape from abusive situations. We provided temporary housing counseling, legal assistance, and job training. The name came from Miss Florence's favorite saying, "Wildflowers grow in the hardest places, and they're the most beautiful because they've had to fight for every bit of sunlight." The association grew rapidly, attracting volunteers, donations, and the attention of state officials. We opened our first formal shelter in 1987, a residential facility that could house up to 20 women and their children. It was located on land adjacent to Miss Florence's original farm, creating a campus of healing. I began speaking publicly about my experiences, something that terrified me at first, but that I knew was necessary. My story had power. It could help people understand the reality of child abuse, the cycles of violence that trapped families, and the possibility of healing and redemption. The first time I spoke to a large audience was at a conference on child welfare in Louisville. I was 35 years old, standing before 300 social workers, law enforcement officers, and child advocates. My hands were shaking as I approached the microphone. When I was 7 years old, I began, my grandmother made arrangements that put me in a very difficult situation. For the next 5 years, she continued these arrangements with different people, treating me as a source of income while I experienced great hardship. The room was completely silent. I continued telling my story with all its horrible details, but also with its message of hope and transformation. When I finished, the entire audience stood and applauded, many of them crying. Afterward, dozens of people approached me, some to thank me for my courage, others to share their own stories of abuse and survival. I realized that my voice had power, that my story could help others feel less alone and inspire them to seek help. I began traveling throughout Kentucky and neighboring states, speaking at conferences, universities, and community events. Each time I told my story, I met other survivors, other advocates, other people working to protect children and heal trauma. In 1990, I published my autobiography, Flowers Among Thorns: A Survivor's Journey from Abuse to Healing. The book became a bestseller, not because people enjoyed reading about horror, but because it offered genuine hope to those who had experienced similar trauma. Letters poured in from readers around the world. Women wrote to tell me that my story had given them courage to leave abusive relationships. Survivors of childhood sexual abuse wrote to say that my book had helped them understand that they weren't alone, that healing was possible. One letter, from a young woman in Indiana, particularly moved me. "Your story saved my life. I was planning to kill myself because I couldn't live with the shame of what my stepfather did to me. But reading about your journey from victim to survivor to advocate showed me that there was another way. Thank you for proving that we can overcome even the worst experiences." As my work gained national attention, I received numerous awards and honors. In 1995, I was inducted into the Kentucky Women's Hall of Fame. In 2000, I received the Jefferson Award for Public Service. In 2010, I was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for my work combating child abuse and helping survivors heal. But the recognition that meant the most to me came in 2015 when the state of Kentucky named our shelter system the Florence Zelda Network, honoring both the woman who had saved me and the work we had built together. By this time, our organization was operating 12 shelters across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. We had helped over 10,000 women and children escape abusive situations, and our model was being replicated in other states. I continued working well into my 60s, driven by the knowledge that as long as children were being abused, as long as women were being trafficked and exploited, there was more work to be done. My own children grew up to be wonderful adults. Nina became a pediatrician, specializing in treating children who had experienced trauma. Matthew became a social worker, following in my footsteps of helping others heal from abuse. Claire became a lawyer, focusing on prosecuting cases of child abuse and human trafficking. All three of them continued the family tradition of service, but from a place of health and choice rather than desperation and survival. They married loving partners, raised healthy children, and carried forward the values of respect, protection, and healing that Joseph and I had tried to instill in them. In 2018, when I was 65, I officially retired from day-to-day operations of the Wildflowers Association, though I remained as chairman emeritus. The organization was in good hands, led by a new generation of advocates and survivors who understood the mission and had the energy to carry it forward. Joseph and I returned to the original farm, now surrounded by the campus of healing facilities we had built together. We spent our days tending the herb gardens, writing, and enjoying visits from our children and grandchildren. In 2021, I received a call that would represent the culmination of my life's work. I was being awarded the Presidential Medal of Human Rights, the highest honor given to civilians who have made extraordinary contributions to human rights and social justice. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., with my entire family present. As I stood before the president and the assembled dignitaries, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, from a terrified 7-year-old being sold by her grandmother to a woman being honored for her work protecting children. In my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of breaking cycles of violence, about the power of speaking truth to power, about the responsibility we all have to protect the vulnerable. I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a survivor, I said. Not as someone who was broken by trauma, but as someone who was strengthened by overcoming it. My story is not unique. There are millions of children suffering in silence right now, trapped in cycles of abuse that seem inescapable. But I want them to know that escape is possible. Healing is possible. A life of meaning and purpose is possible even after the worst experiences. We must never give up on the possibility of redemption, on the power of love, to overcome hatred, on the strength of the human spirit, to triumph over evil. After the ceremony, I was approached by a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. She was crying as she spoke to me. "Mrs. Zelda?" She said, "I wanted to thank you. I was trafficked as a child, and I've been living at one of your shelters for the past year. Your story gave me hope when I had none. Because of the work you started, I'm safe now. I'm in college, and I'm going to become a counselor to help other girls like us." I hugged her tightly, this young woman, who represented everything I had worked for, proof that the cycle could be broken, that victims could become survivors, that survivors could become healers. "You are my true reward," I told her. "You and all the others who have found safety and healing. You are the reason this work matters." Today, as I sit in my garden at age 72, I am surrounded by the fruits of a lifetime of healing work. The Wildflowers Association operates in 12 states, has helped over 50,000 women and children, and has inspired similar organizations around the world. My children and grandchildren visit regularly, filling the house with laughter and the kind of family joy I never experienced as a child. They are healthy, happy, and whole, living proof that cycles of abuse can be broken, that families can heal, that love can triumph over trauma.
Joseph and I celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary last year. He is still the gentle, patient man who saw past my wounds to the strength beneath. Together, we have built not just a marriage, but a legacy of hope and healing. The farm itself has been transformed into a place of beauty and peace. The herb gardens that Miss Florence started have grown into extensive medicinal gardens that supply our shelters and training programs. The little chapel where I once hid in terror has been restored and is now used for weddings and celebrations, a place where joy has overcome fear. I still receive letters from readers of my book from women who have found strength in my story, from survivors who have gone on to help others. Each letter reminds me that sharing our stories, even the most painful ones, has power to heal, not just ourselves, but others. My mother lived to see much of this work come to fruition. She died in 2010 at age 87, peaceful and surrounded by family. Before she passed, she told me how proud she was of what I had accomplished, how grateful she was that I had found a way to transform our family's legacy of pain into one of healing. "You did what I couldn't do," she said in one of our last conversations. "You broke the cycle. You saved not just yourself, but countless others. That's the greatest gift a mother could ask for." I think often about my grandmother Josephine, the woman who caused so much pain in my life. I've come to understand that she too was a victim of the cycle of abuse, trapped by poverty and ignorance and her own unhealed trauma. I don't forgive what she did to me, but I understand it in a way that brings me peace. The men who abused me, some of them faced legal consequences for their actions, though many never did. The justice system was different, then less protective of children, more willing to look the other way. But I've found my own justice in the work I've done, in the children I've helped protect, in the women I've helped heal. Mr. Carlyle, the man who tried to kill me, was eventually arrested for similar crimes against other children. He died in prison, and I felt no satisfaction in his death, only sadness for all the children who had suffered at his hands. As I prepare to share this story with you, my dear friends, I want you to know that healing is possible. It's not easy, it's not quick, and it's not complete. I still have nightmares, sometimes still struggle with trust, still carry scars that will never fully fade. But I have learned that our wounds don't define us. What defines us is what we do with our wounds, how we use our pain to help others, how we transform our trauma into purpose and meaning. If you are listening to this story and you recognize yourself in it, if you are a child being abused, a woman being trafficked, a survivor struggling to heal, please know that you are not alone. There are people who care about you, who want to help you, who believe in your strength and your worth. Reach out. Tell someone. Find the courage to break the silence that keeps you trapped. There are organizations like the Wildflowers Association all over the country, ready to help you build a new life. And if you are someone who has the power to help, if you are a teacher, a neighbor, a friend who suspects that someone is being abused, please don't look the other way. Speak up. Report what you see. Be the person who breaks the cycle of silence and complicity. My story began with a 7-year-old girl being sold by her grandmother. It ends with a 72-year-old woman surrounded by love, honored for her service to others, and at peace with her place in the world. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It took decades of healing, of hard work, of choosing hope over despair, of believing that even the most broken things can be made whole again. But it happened. And if it can happen for me, a girl from the poorest of backgrounds, with the most traumatic of childhoods, it can happen for anyone. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing in the power of healing, in the possibility of redemption, in the strength of the human spirit, to overcome even the darkest circumstances. If this story has touched your heart, please share it with others. Not because I need recognition, but because somewhere out there is a child, a woman, a survivor who needs to know that they are not alone, that their pain is not their fault, and that a better life is possible. Together, we can break the cycles of abuse.
Together, we can protect the vulnerable. Together, we can create a world where every child is safe, where every woman is valued, where every survivor is honored for their strength. That is my prayer, my hope, and my continued mission. Even at 72, even after all these years, the work continues. Because as long as there are children suffering in silence, as long as there are women trapped in cycles of violence, as long as there are survivors who need to know that healing is possible, the work will never be finished. But each story shared, each life saved, each cycle broken, brings us closer to the world we're trying to create. A world where stories like mine become impossible, where children are protected, where women are safe, where families are sanctuaries of love rather than sites of trauma. That is the legacy I want to leave. Not just my own healing, but the healing of others. Not just my own survival, but the thriving of all those who come after me. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for listening, for caring, for believing in the possibility of transformation. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can break the cycles that have trapped too many for too long. This is Grandma Zelda signing off from my peaceful farm in Kentucky, surrounded by the love I never thought I'd have, grateful for the journey that brought me here, and hopeful for the future we're building together. May you find peace in your own journey. May you find strength in your own struggles. And may you always remember that you are valued, you are loved, and you are never alone. God bless you all, and thank you for letting me share my story with you.